In light of recent events, I think it's time that we have a bit of a talk about abuse in spiritual communities. Last Friday, May 10th, the Troth expelled Diana Paxson, a longtime elder, teacher, and arguably one of the most critical members of the organization in its history, development, practices, and spirituality, due to allegations of abuse, which were first reported by a member of the Troth's clergy training program, and then subsequently by the Provisional Board of the Fellowship of Fire and Ice. The gist of these allegations, as there are more details available in the Wild Hunt's write-up on the decision, are that Paxson was at least somewhat aware of acts of abuse that were happening first against children and then other members of her community that were in places under her power, and that she took decisions to protect those engaging in these acts of abuse. If you want to read all the particulars, you can go take a look at that link, which I've provided below. What I want to get into here is not so much the details of what took place, but more how is it that these kinds of abuse and enabling are patterns that keep popping up within the pagan and heathen movements. If our movements are supposed to be a break from the norms of Christianity and other forms of spirituality influenced by it, then why is it that our community still seems to be repeating these patterns of abuse that show some pretty striking similarity to what has popped up in everything from the Catholic Church to different megachurches and local congregations? The short answer to that is, even though the spiritualities that pagans and heathens are engaging in are significantly different from what you see in Christianity and other mainstream forms of spirituality, we still are, in some cases, unconsciously, in others, consciously, repeating the patterns that exist within those systems. And more broadly, that spiritual organizations and communities are prone to enabling abuse due to very particular circumstances that one finds within spiritual spaces. Unless accountability and transparency are actively built in to a spiritual community, then these factors, which I'll get into more over the course of this episode, will lead to abusive patterns popping up and becoming institutionalized and normalized. What I'm going to get into today are patterns of organization within spiritual community that can lead to and often encourage different forms of abuse. The reasons why I'm going to be taking this approach are first that generally I tend more towards a systems-based analysis of ideas, societies, communities, and stuff like that. It's what comes with my academic training and is also something that I think is very useful for looking at the ways that organizations of all kinds operate. The other major reason why I'm taking this approach is because when you look at these instances of abuse and harm that happen within spiritual communities, it's usually not just a question of one person doing harm. It's a matter of many people enabling and perpetuating that harm. If it takes a village to properly nurture and care for someone, then it also takes a village to enable serial abuse. I'm going to break this topic down into 4 chunks. First, the problem of spiritual authority, particularly how spiritual authority can be an especially dangerous kind of authority, and the ways that one can effectively, to varying degrees, check these problems. I'm going to then get into the power of charisma and the way that this creates cults of personality, which are, I think without question, in pagan and heathen spaces, the most common forms of systematic abuse. I'm going to then spread outward to another way that these kinds of abuse can be perpetuated, in what I refer to as spiritual oligarchy. I'm going to then discuss the process of how all of this becomes institutionalized at a larger scale, with a particular focus on how this tends to be coming from a place of protecting those in positions of power and influence, more than necessarily on inflicting the direct abuse itself. Though it has to be said, this process of institutionalization is what makes abuse especially difficult to root out within different spiritual communities. As I've often said in many different platforms and places, most people are not going to willingly put themselves underneath the power of a jackbooted dictatorship. It takes easing them in, creating systems that apologize for and enable systematic abuse of power and abuse of people, and finding ways to normalize forms of abuse and enabling of abuse that don't come across as inherently abusive. So let's kick it off with the problem of spiritual authority. Historically speaking, spiritual and religious authority is probably one of the most unassailable forms of authority that exists. And this is for pretty straightforward reasons. Authority that is granted within a spiritual or religious space is founded on an understanding of that the person who holds that authority enjoys some kind of favor from otherworldly powers. It doesn't really matter if this power is the God of Abraham, Ra, Odin, the mandate of heaven, or whatever else it is that you use to justify it. The common theme is pretty much the same. This is not to say that all forms of spiritual authority or power within spiritual spaces inherently tend in this direction. There are certainly examples from different indigenous practices around the world, as well as within different elements of the modern pagan and heathen movements, such as, for example, reclaiming witchcraft, where it is more clearly understood that people who are spiritual workers and practitioners are serving more as a bridge or a facilitator than necessarily as a person with power over others. On May 13th, heathen witch Irene Glass wrote an excellent article on this called Breaking the Pedestal, which gets into this distinction between skill and morality. That just because someone is skilled in a particular craft, including, say, ritual and knowledge and spiritual practice, doesn't necessarily mean they're inherently more moral than others. I've also included a link to this one in the episode notes so you can check it out yourself. That said, even though there is pushback that's been developing, as well as alternative models that have existed for handling spiritual authority and spiritual roles in ways that don't lead to accumulating power within the hands of those people, that often is not the case. This is, again, because in instances where spiritual power and authority is being abused and being used as a way of propping up power systems, it's because the logic behind it is one that's extremely difficult to challenge on its own terms. When you say a certain person is in charge in this particular spiritual community because they are especially attuned to God, the gods, the ancestors, whatever it should happen to be that is the object of veneration, it's sort of difficult to then effectively say, well, we disagree with that, because this person is considered by the people around them to have that authority, is seen as being able to speak for those particular forces, and because they are endowed with authority because of this from those different otherworldly forces, whether explicitly or implicitly, to challenge their authority is to do more than just challenge that individual. You are challenging the will of God, the gods, whatever the powers are in question in your particular spiritual space. Often the only meaningful ways when working within such a system to challenge these problems is to either break away and establish a new way of doing things, or to walk away completely. When spiritual authority is viewed in this kind of head-on perspective, it makes sense why spiritual and religious movements are often prone to schism and divisions. When authority is something that is that difficult to challenge within the logic of the existing movement, and this is something that is pretty consistent throughout different religious practices across the span of human history, then you really don't have that many options other than saying, well, I reject your logic, and I'm going to approach this with a new logic, or I'm going to just negate everything completely. The history of the modern left and religion shows a similar pattern of what you often see within different spaces where you see left-wing and religious ideas coming together, is that these more left-leaning approaches to religion are either divergent sects within a larger framework that allows for a degree of divergence, or they're completely new breakaway movements. That's also before we get into the whole phenomenon of leftist atheism, which has its roots in the very close relationships that existed historically in Europe between the different established religions, whether you're talking the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the various Protestant sects that existed, and the political systems of their day. It makes a certain amount of sense, after all, that if you're going to reject the state that is supposed to be sanctified and protected by God, then why not take the next step and also reject God? Within more authoritarian religious and spiritual spaces, the only direction that challenges can actually originate is usually flowing from top to bottom. And this is something that, again, makes sense when we go back to that religious and spiritual authority within these kind of high control, more authoritarian kind of spaces is seen as a mandate from the different higher powers venerated within that space. Within this framework, it makes sense that those who are considered higher up on the proverbial scale or pyramid or whatever model it is you want to use are the ones who are closer to the knowledge of divinity and therefore better informed to be able to make judgments on those below them. What this also means is that the people who are at the top, because they're the ones who are the most justified in making these kind of challenges and critiques within such systems, tend to stay at the top, unless something seriously disrupts or challenges their particular system of power. One factor that also reinforces these tendencies, as Irene Glass points out, is, particularly in the United States, but generally within the world influenced by Christianity, there is an active conflation of being godly with being good. That is to say, those who are religious or spiritual authorities are automatically treated as being more moral, more discerning, or otherwise better human beings than other people. One excellent example of this tendency can be found with a little bit of Googling by going back to the obituaries that came out around the time that Jerry Falwell kicked the bucket. For folks tuning in from outside of the United States or who are not themselves elder millennials and up in terms of age, Jerry Falwell was one of the most important televangelists when it came to building the religious right in the United States as we know it. He also regularly trafficked in incredibly hateful rhetoric against LGBT people, people of other religions, people of forms of Christianity that he didn't agree with, and he also had absolutely no problem with enabling all kinds of abuse within his particular community as long as he could look the other way or take advantage of it. When Falwell died, most obituaries that discussed him mostly focused on him being a lifelong man of God, a preacher who did the work of the Lord and all that, and tended to ignore things like how shortly after September 11th, he blamed that particular incident on the United States allowing LGBT people to exist. By the way, this is well before gay marriage had been legalized, and when you could count on one hand how many states did not allow the trans panic defense to be admissible in a court of law as a way of defending yourself if you murdered a trans person. This tendency has been changing over the years, but it is safe to say that being a man of the cloth, especially in the United States, is a great way to get traditional institutions and much of mainstream society to look the other way to what it is that you are actually saying and doing under the cover of the cloth. So, how do we build spiritual authority then that doesn't fall into this trap? To turn again to Irene Glass, just because you have people who are especially skilled or knowledgeable in spiritual matters doesn't mean you're going to necessarily wind up in these kind of high control authoritarian environments. There are, as I've mentioned, many indigenous traditions as well as many pagan traditions that have avoided this. Another excellent resource worth consulting for understanding these questions and developing safer and accountable community is Starhawk's The Empowerment Manual. What all of these practices have in common, such as, for example, reclaiming witchcraft, is an emphasis on service, on keeping people in these positions accountable, and maintaining transparency. What also helps is keeping the actual decision-making for the community as a whole separated from having spiritual authority. To put it another way, if someone is an effective ritualist, mystic, and leader within spiritual spaces, that doesn't mean they're making decisions for the whole of the community, and they are simply one voice among many rather than the voice that makes the decisions. This also means communities and how authority works within those communities has to be built from the bottom up. Power has to rest in the hands of the community collectively rather than in any specific offices, individuals, or bodies. So with all of that said, we're now going to jump into how spiritual authority in the abusive sense is built up and maintained. The best place to start here is the power of charisma and cult of personality. Cult of personality is a term that folks tend to hear thrown around a lot. And to give a short definition here, a cult of personality is a situation where a particular individual is elevated in some way or another by the community or society that they're operating in. This individual is endowed through the cult with extraordinary wisdom, importance, influence, as well as power, and all that goes with that. Cult of personality tends to be fairly singular in focus, in that it zooms in on and elevates a particular personality as being this especially gifted, capable, and powerful person. I think there's no dispute that the case of Diana Paxson, especially with what has come to light recently, is a pretty clear-cut example of cult of personality. For folks who have participated in her organization Hrafnar, like I have, or within the Troth, which she had a significant amount of influence on, it was not hard to find all kinds of examples until fairly recently of Paxson being held up as this incredibly gifted, wise, and capable individual, someone who especially knew the material, was especially discerning in how she approached it, and was particularly in tune with the gods because of her extended work and study. There was also, at least in my experience, a tendency towards offering excuses for when there were problems, shortcomings, or even outright factual errors in material put forward by Paxson. This tendency is something that's an important element of cult of personality, and is also the contradiction that's at the heart of any cult of personality. When there is a mistake, an error, or a genuine misdeed that is done by the object of that cult, there's usually some kind of excuse, which often, though not always, involves deflecting blame to another particular individual. There are some pretty stark examples that come from Stalinist Russia, which is often held up as one of the best examples of a secular cult of personality in the 20th century. These examples consist of people writing letters from the gulags where they were imprisoned to Stalin and to the Communist Party, pleading to be released on the grounds of, there's no possible way that Comrade Stalin, who is wise and beneficent and the protector of all the workers of the Soviet Union, would ever allow for these kind of abuses to happen under his rule, even though that whole police state system was something he had built from the ground up. Cult of personality is something that tends to be, though isn't always, monarchic in nature, which is to say there's the object of the cult of personality who is at the pinnacle of that particular group. People who participate in these kind of cults, and sometimes it could also be a small group at the top as well, gain benefit from having access to this authority and permission to use and at times abuse that authority. Power flows from the top, and those who are closer to the top are the ones who enjoy more power than others. Now, all of this said, it is somewhat distressingly common to see cults of personality emerging within pagan and heathen spaces. I think there's also a particular reason why this is the case within our spaces, and that is something I got into in my previous episode about community, which I refer to as the asymmetry of knowledge. This means that what tends to be a thing among especially older pagan communities, not as much newer ones where we're living in the age of the internet and information's becoming increasingly accessible, is that actual detailed knowledge and information on these different practices, rituals, and other similar stuff tends to be difficult to get at because it's often academic or it's literally occult in nature and therefore requires access to specialized sources and training. And this makes it possible for certain individuals to enjoy a far greater understanding of the spirituality and what's expected within it than others. This also becomes something that can be leveraged as a way of exerting influence over others, and also, consciously or not, leads to people flocking to those who are seen as having this knowledge and understanding. I think it is fair to say that a lot of pagan cults of personality tend to start out unintentionally and inadvertently, which is to say the person who is at the center of that particular cult was there because they knew the rituals and they had better knowledge of the stuff than the other people involved in their particular community, and then over time they became increasingly elevated, placed up on a pedestal, and treated as someone worthy of superior authority over those who were around them. It's also very easy for people in positions of power to really let it go to their head. This, by the way, is why I think it's extremely important for power and authority within a community to be vested in that community collectively rather than specific offices or individuals, and also why we really need to emphasize transparency and accountability. Otherwise, it gets very easy for people who are in positions of authority to start getting into the sort of self-justifying loop of, well, what I do is considered to be right and honorable and ethical by the people around me, so therefore what I do is going to continue to encourage these conditions and is in the interest of perpetuating and growing this community, so therefore what I am doing is right because I am right, as opposed to what I'm doing is right because what I am doing is a right and justified action on its own merits. Where power corrupts, it is because power, when left unchecked, can become intoxicating. Now, this is not to say there are not deliberate cults of personality that emerge within pagan and heathen spaces. I've certainly seen quite a few, and arguably the Asatru Folk Assembly began as a very deliberate cult of personality by Stephen McNallen. That said, I think it is important to recognize and discuss that cult of personality is something that can happen inadvertently because of this asymmetry of knowledge problem, as well as this tendency to conflate power with spiritual knowledge and authority. Actively predatory individuals and groups, without question, are a thing and are quite dangerous in their own way. But they're not the only way that you can wind up with cult of personality. That, I think, segues things nicely towards talking about the concept of spiritual oligarchy, and how this is something that is related but different from cult of personality. Now, oligarchy, just to define it really quick, is a Greek term that you'll see in political science and stuff like that a lot, which translates as rule by the few, in contrast to monarchy, which is rule by the one, and democracy, which is rule by the demos, often translated as people, though who makes up the people is one of the central contentions in the history of modern democracies. Now, when we're talking rule by the few within oligarchy, what this means in practice is people who are seen as beneficial and useful to those who are in power and reinforce those systems of power. This is what makes oligarchy a bit different from monarchy or other forms of authoritarian systems. Power is something that is shared among the oligarchs. It's not simply a question of there's one person in charge and they have the different people that are serving them beneath them, as you would see in a classic case of a cult of personality. It's more that you have several individuals who are in positions of power and authority who depend on and reinforce each other's power. Their authority is, to use a more complex term for a second, co-constitutive, which means they need each other for the whole system to work. Oligarchy, because it depends on this cooperation between people in positions of power, is also something that can be a bit more stable in the long term than just a straight cult of personality. The reason why is because cult of personality rests on the particular individual or small group of individuals who are at the top of that cult, who have been elevated above and beyond the rest. What this means is if that person or a small group of persons should ever fall from grace or otherwise be discredited and lose power, then that cult of personality runs into a lot of problems in terms of keeping itself around and perpetuating itself. Oligarchy, on the other hand, is quite a bit more resilient, because if someone screws up, makes a big mistake, or more importantly, pushed a strategic direction that has failed, then they can be replaced by someone else within the oligarchic system, peacefully or otherwise. A great example of this within heathen spaces is the Asatru Folk Assembly, an organization which, as I mentioned earlier in this episode, did start as something of a deliberate cult of personality by Stephen McNallen, but more importantly, McNallen rested the Asatru Folk Assembly on a specific idea, his concept of metagenetics. This is an important distinction, because McNallen's authority ultimately rested not so much on that he himself was an especially gifted, intelligent, connected to the gods, what have you person, but rather on, as he argued, the rightness of his idea and his positions. This is also a common feature that you'll see in oligarchic systems throughout history. Legitimacy often rests not so much on that the particular person is the one who is deserving to hold power, but rather that the oligarchy and the ideas they represent are ones that are worthy and worth defending. This means that you have a different set of defensive and deflection tactics than the cult of personality. A classic cult of personality requires that the person at the center of the cult be someone who is, at the very least, seen as beyond reproach. Oligarchic distributions of power, instead, will frequently make the argument that it's not that the ideas failed, it's that the people implementing the program were the ones who failed. Within the Asatru Folk Assembly, you had multiple different institutions that had varying levels of power, all of which sort of depended on one another. You had the folk builders, who were essentially the regional chiefs, for lack of a better way to put it, within the AFA. You also had the AFA board. And you also had leaders of the different local AFA kindreds. Each of these individuals' power depended on supporting, protecting, and reinforcing the power of the others. It also meant that when Matt Flavel replaced Stephen McNallen as the actual person in charge at the AFA, this process was able to go over, I'll admit, more seamlessly than I expected and a lot of other folks did, because Flavel was able to build support from within these different bodies in the AFA and promised to basically keep scratching each other's backs. Now, what's important to emphasize here when I'm talking about oligarchy within spiritual communities is that this is not the same thing as having a complex organization with one person at the top and a number of people implementing their will. This is a situation where there are genuinely multiple different power centers who all have to cooperate to a degree to maintain their shared power. A good way to answer the question of if a particular spiritual organization is oligarchic as opposed to being a, strictly speaking, classic cult of personality is if you can remove the person at the top, or the persons at the top, and still have that system continue to function. A good example of this in more mainstream religion is the New Apostolic Reformation, a form of charismatic Christianity that has been emerging since like the late 1980s, 1990s, beginning with the leadership of one C. Peter Wagner, who died back in, I want to say, 2016. Wagner and his acolytes formed a kind of spiritual authority that was explicitly oligarchic in nature, where power was shared between prophets, disciples, pastors, and other folks in positions of power and authority. They had very informal but potent and closely networked institutions. And if you want to get into a lot more details on this, check out Matthew Taylor's podcast, Charismatic Revival Fury. The short version that matters for our conversation is C. Peter Wagner's death, and nothing really has happened to his reputation within the movement as far as I know, did nothing to really deter the movement's continued growth, because by the time he died, the movement had been constructed in a way that power was distributed among all of these different elites and leaders. They were also encouraged to cooperate and deal with their differences behind closed doors as opposed to out in the open. This again is also something that's a feature of oligarchy that is somewhat similar to cult of personality, but is also a bit different. You don't see open dissension within the members of the oligarchic caste, because they understand that their power depends on protecting each other. So if there are problems, they're going to be taken care of behind closed doors, quietly, and with some kind of nice-looking excuse to sweep the whole situation under the rug, if situations should develop. So now that we've talked a bit about the different structures that you're going to see for these systems of abuse and power, it's time to talk about how abuse becomes institutionalized. The institutionalization of abuse is a process that takes time to really set in, because what makes abuse institutionalized is when abuse or enabling of abuse becomes normal within the operations of that particular group or organization. This, by the way, is something that is key. Most organizations and institutions within society will have instances of people who abuse the authority they have, or individuals who come into positions of influence who overstep their bounds and engage in unacceptable behavior. The difference between institutions where these instances happen versus institutions where it is systemic is that institutions where such abuse has become systemic are ones where such behavior is normal to varying degrees and often treated as a perk or otherwise a hazard of the job. Another key difference also between institutions which have abusive actors and institutions who institutionalize abuse is institutions who have abusive actors also tend to have systems of accountability that act with varying degrees of swiftness and decisiveness to deal with these abusive actors, whereas ones that have institutionalized that abuse will keep those people around for years or even decades, often shuffling them around, moving them into different positions, or otherwise allowing them to continue to engage in acts of abuse that are protected. The underlying logic of institutionalized abuse is pretty much always that it is more important to protect people in those positions of power than it is to protect the people who are, in theory, served by that particular institution. This is often, though not always, because again, the way that power and legitimacy works within institutionally abusive spaces is that it depends on the figure of cult of personality, agents of the oligarchy, or whatever other system of power that exists being held as beyond reproach and always defensible in their actions. What also makes abusive systems institutionalized is when you see a number of practices develop to defend those who engage in these acts of abuse, particularly when they are individuals who are in positions of power and authority. Easily one of the most common examples of this is having systems of accountability, protections for whistleblowers and the like that exist on paper, but in practice tend to lack real force or ability to compel accountability from the people who engage in acts of abuse and harm. These systems of accountability also tend to be structured in ways that ignore the enablers and focus exclusively on the bad actors, assuming, of course, that the bad actors are ever meaningfully brought to justice. We can see this in the case of, for example, the Catholic Church, where, on the surface, priests who engaged in abuse of members of their congregation would be reassigned to a different parish, so that superficially they could say to that particular parish, oh, we took care of that. You won't have to worry about Father so-and-so anymore because we made him somebody else's problem, but we sort of left that part out, so don't worry about it. Reassignment and reshuffling, by the way, is such a frequent and popular solution to such problems that it's also shown up in places like American policing, the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Boy Scouts of America. What these examples all have in common is that the goal is preserving the appearance of power having legitimacy, rather than bringing genuine consequences to those who have abused the power that they hold. This also, by the way, is sort of the upper end of what might happen as a way of creating the appearance of accountability without substantively delivering on it. What will also tend to happen are different forms of silencing or otherwise minimizing the victims of abuse. Campaigns of shaming and discrediting victims are extremely common, where frequently the abuse itself will be dismissed on the grounds that the victim, for whatever reason or another, is either misrepresenting what happened or in some way what happened really wasn't as bad as it seems. Gaslighting is a very frequent tactic within this particular range of behavior. And the reason why is because it works really well for maintaining the legitimacy of power. If, after all, those who are in power are the ones who are the most right, the most morally justified, and the most capable people to be holding those offices, then anyone who's challenging them must be in some way or another in the wrong. And this becomes used to spin, minimize, or otherwise distort the reality of what happened. What often starts as a question of the credibility of what happens is turned instead into attacks on the character and the position of those who suffered abuse, especially if the people who did are not ones who are within positions of power or closely associated with those who have power within the community in question. At the most extreme end, this involves a silencing and driving out of the victims of that abuse from the community where the abuse occurred. It is, after all, a lot easier to say no abuse happened if the people who were abused aren't around to tell their story. What takes these tactics from acts that happen within the particular context of covering for a particular abuse to level of institutionalization is when these become normalized. When anyone who raises questions about abuse is pretty consistently shunned or discredited for doing so. When it becomes the norm within a community to outright dismiss concerns that lead in this direction because those concerns might raise uncomfortable questions. Such environments also tend to attract abusive individuals because they know once they get within the right spot within that community, they will be protected. They know that victims and survivors will not be believed because the community has conditioned itself to already not believe them when instructed by people in positions of power. These kind of systems of response, deflection, and suppression often manifest in far more subtle ways before the overt expressions pop up. These can be things like being taken aside and having a little conversation about how maybe we shouldn't talk about that, or you don't understand the whole story, or other vague but clearly somewhat threatening answers that don't really address the underlying concern, but do communicate that the topic in question is one that's off limits, or that raising questions around a particular person is not acceptable. What you will also often see is deflection onto something that is safer ground for that community to defend, or at least safer ground as that community perceives it. One common experience that I know I had in many heathen spaces prior to Declaration 127 was being accused of dividing the community or causing controversy or tearing down rather than building whenever bringing up the problem of white nationalism and white supremacy in folkish spaces and within the heathen movement broadly. What was going on in those conversations was not an attempt to address the substance of what I or other folks like me were saying, but rather an attempt to shift the dialogue, to move the goalposts in a direction that was safer for them. That was something that they could argue on their terms that didn't require actually addressing the matter at hand. Blaming problems on outside agitators is also quite popular, as is ascribing some kind of nefarious motive to the people who are raising concerns about genuine and legitimate problems. If you are in a space where these patterns are popping up around concerning or problematic behaviors, then you may be dealing with a space where there's already a level of institutional and systemic abuse in play. You will also see these same behaviors from when people in these positions of power actually get caught and forced to answer for it in some way or another. Usually what you'll see are apologies that tend to really be sort of non-apologies, if there's one at all. And when I say non-apology, I mean they don't actually admit to wrongdoing in any explicit way, while attempting to appeal to, look at all the good work I've done, or I promise to never allow these kind of things again, without addressing how the thing happened or why it happened in the first place. The object of such non-apologies from people in positions of power is to maintain the legitimacy of the power, rather than to address the actual problem. And that, I think, is a good place to wrap things up for now. Addressing abusive systems within our movement is a process and a conversation that's going to need to continue over the course of weeks, months, and years down the line. It's something we'll need to be continuously vigilant for and constantly be working on, and should never, in any instance, be treated as a settled matter. Addressing abuse and the authoritarian systems that enable it needs to be a continuous process that never ends, just as community and its development is continuous. And on that note, thank you all again for listening. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.